Today is November 21st, 2025. My name is Chi Pham, and I'm here today with Dr. Sunjay Devarajan of Baylor College of Medicine on behalf of the Houston Asian American Archive at Rice University. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here with you.
Would you mind starting the interview by just stating your full name, where and when you were born?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm Sunjay R. Devarajan. I was born in Fort Worth, Texas in 1986.
And how do you identify yourself ethnically?
I think of myself as Asian American, Indian American, primarily.
Thank you. And starting with the questions, let's start with your family. Where in India are your parents from, and what's the story of how they ended up in Fort Worth, and what did they do for work?
Yeah, my parents are both from the state of Tamil Nadu in India, and Tamil Nadu is a state in the southern part of the country. It borders Kerala, and they are actually from a city that is well known to more like religious observers type. It's a city called Madurai, which is kind of known as a temple town. One of the most famous Hindu temples is located. It's called the Meenakshi Amman Temple. And both of my parents are from there. My dad is from a small town called Nagarkoil outside of Madurai, and my mom is from TVS Nagar, which is outside of, which is really like more of a kind of an alcove or like a neighborhood within Madurai. They got married. My dad was already, so he came to Arlington. He actually moved to Arlington from India. He went to a very prestigious school in India called IIT Madras, and sort of a high-achieving engineer type. And he moved to Texas, Arlington specifically, for a UT Arlington PhD position. And really, the reason he did that was that he had a mentor there that was willing to sort of take him on and mentor him. So my dad was here for a few years. I think he came in 76, and then he, in 79, came back to India, met my mom, and they got married, and she shortly thereafter moved to Texas to be with him. So that's sort of the genesis of our Texas story.
So growing up in the Fort Worth suburbs in the 80s and 90s, were there many other families around? How was it like growing up in your neighborhood, in your high schools?
Yeah, so I grew up in Arlington, which is kind of it's a suburb of Fort Worth, as you mentioned, kind of smack between, closer to Fort Worth, but between Fort Worth and Dallas. And in Arlington was primarily had primarily a white community. Probably second most was Hispanic population, and probably third Black population. And then more of like a smattering, I would say, of Asian families. And by Asian families, I do mean more broadly Asian. Like we had Chinese families, Vietnamese families, Korean families, and then Indian families. Most of sort of the Indian diaspora wasn't closer to Dallas, in and around Plano. So growing up, my schools were predominantly white, and I remember we would go to like the Dallas area pretty much at the drop of a hat almost every weekend without fail growing up, because really that's where the music and arts community, sort of rooted in the Indian traditions, resided. And so we were always commuting to Dallas for Indian type events.
That sounds awesome. Did your family feel the need to assimilate into the mainstream white community, or would you say that this community that you were involved in, did it otherwise instill a sense of pride and belonging despite being a minority in Arlington?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm still, to this day wrapping my head around the assimilation bit, because I think my parents were good at. They made assimilation a focus, but also not. And, one of the things that I recall was spending a lot of time with Indian families in the Dallas area. And then, of course, during the week when I would be at school, most of my friends were white or Hispanic. And that was just the majority of kids that were there. So I think that part of that experience, let me put my experiences in front first, which is I think that kind of having both sort of a diverse community of people that I was growing up around, in addition to having a very solely Indian community on the weekends for kind of like arts and entertainment type of interactions. I think that kind of allowed us, me, my brother, my sister, to be. We were able to assimilate better, and we always kind of called ourselves chameleons because we felt like we could sort of adapt to the environment, and that's actually something that kind of sticks with us. My parents, though, looking at them, I think that they were pretty good at making assimilation a focal point, but I don't know that ever truly translated into close friendships. So I remember, there was a family called the Gipkis. They were notable because they were probably the unique, notable white family that my parents were quite close with, and I think Chuck Gipke was a colleague of my dad's, and so we would get together with their families pretty often. But I would say outside of that, I think that they generally felt a lot more comfortable being around other Indian people, and because they had that option. Particularly on the weekends, they seized it, and I think that probably did get in the way of them so-called assimilating more than they ended up doing.
Thank you. I actually resonated a lot with what you said. When my family moved to this country, we also happened to have like a white family that we stuck around for some reason. So yeah, I completely get it. And I wanted to ask more about your siblings. What is your relationship with them like, and what do they do for work?
Yeah, we have a great relationship. I'm one of three. I'm the middle child. My older brother, Vijay, is he's an engineer by trade, but has sort of spent a lot of time in management consulting. He's an MBA from NYU Stern. He worked with McKinsey for a long time, eBay, Capital One. Now he's actually working with a really interesting startup in Austin. They're kind of based out of Seattle, but most of the working is done in Austin. So he's close by. He lived in New York for many years, but he moved around the time that I moved to Houston. He moved to Austin. My sister lives in Seattle. She is a pediatric ER doctor. So she and I are the two docs in the family. And actually, we, maybe counterintuitively, we don't really have that many doctors and even in our extended family. I have a cousin and who has a husband as well, who's a physician. But my sister and I are the two docs in the family. But we have a great relationship, and I'm hoping that my sister moves to Texas soon, so we can all sort of be under the same, at least, state umbrella.
So at home, what languages were typically spoken?
Yeah, so it was it's a joke now, but at the time, my parents were really, really, really strict about us speaking in our native tongue. I think a lot of it was a point of pride, but also a practical decision. And so Tamil is our native tongue, and that's unique, native to the state of Tamil Nadu. So Chennai, which is like a really huge Indian city, is a Tamilian city, and we essentially, my parents would not speak to me unless I spoke to Tamil in them. And obviously, I had lots of misgivings. In fact, there's this one story my parents love to tell, which is that I threatened to run away from home and go to my friend Josh's house because he wouldn't make me speak in Tamil and he would let me speak in English like I wanted to. So me running away from home just consisted of me running to the curb or running to his house for a few hours and then just sitting on our front door curb until my parents showed me some pity and came and got me. But yeah, that was a big focal point of my childhood is knowing the language. And so it's funny when I think about my knowledge. My parents tried to teach me, my mom specifically tried to teach me how to read and write, but it just didn't take. So the way I speak Tamil is actually kind of mysterious to me because I don't think about grammar. I don't think about words. They're just there. I just can speak it. So I have no idea how to read. I have no idea how to write, but I can watch movies. I can talk to my family, and it gets rusty if I don't practice. But even today, all I have to do is spend time with some family speaking the language for even a few hours, few days, and it just feels like old times.
I completely.
English was, as I got older, English became more dominant. And my dad is he was a voracious reader growing up, and my grandfather actually, his dad was also a voracious reader of English. A guy who born and raised in India, but had read every Shakespeare play. He could quote Shakespeare. Read a lot of books on physics and music, musicology in English, and was very, 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 very facile in English. Extraordinary crossword guy. So English was a big focal point. My dad is he's a brilliant speaker as well. And so as I got older and got more sophisticated in my own English, I think we started to connect on the English side as well.
So aside from language, what role did religion, spirituality, or tradition play in your household?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about Hinduism kind of the way I think Jews think about Judaism, which is sometimes it's hard to differentiate where the traditions begin and the religion and the traditions end and where the religion begins, because it's so woven into the day-to-day experience. And so I even like my dad is, my parents are both really big lovers of music, and in particular there's a form of South Indian music, classical music called Carnatic music, which is really steeped in devotion. Most of the songs that you sing are about God and the Hindu epics and stuff. And so the music is sort of inextricable from the religion, and really they play on each other. So that was a really, really big part of it. As far as so I would say music and the dance, my sister's a Bharatanatyam dancer, which is South Indian classical dance. And, anything that she does on stage or was doing on stage was essentially woven into, it was derived from Hindu myths, religious texts. So a lot of the art forms that we focused on really also catered to the religion as well. So I think that it played a role in that way. But, my parents were not traditional, temple-going, God-fearing type of people. We did kind of do yearly rituals. We come, in the old days, we would have been in the Brahmin caste, which is kind of sort of in the upper echelon castes as the caste systems go. And so we took some of those, some of those traditions continue to be important, whether we liked it or not. They continued to be important. And so there were some certain religious aspects of that we sort of carried forward on a year-to-year basis. But we would there would be months that went by and then we didn't go to the temple or the kovil, as we called it. And in that sense, we weren't doing regular pujas at our house and, religious rituals. But I think mostly because of the artistic take that my parents took, we felt ourselves to be very much Hindus and steeped in Hindu tradition.
Yeah, I hear a lot about that with immigrants from Asia who come to the States to pursue a scientific discipline and how they practice a very, I guess the word isn't objective, but a more so objective spirituality. So that's very interesting to hear. Yeah. When did you know that you wanted to be a doctor? Was that something that came from you personally, or was it something that potentially your family could expect it? I know doctors aren't really too large in your family, but...
Yeah, I have to be honest, I did not necessarily want to do it. It didn't come from a natural place, but my dad kind of incepted it in me a little bit. And I remember, distinctly, and I realize I've talked about my dad a lot here because he, from a career standpoint, I think it was very formative what he would tell me, but he kind of he was very practical about it, as a lot of immigrants are, right? Is here's a job that you have kind of a high stature in society. It's a respected position, or at least it was at the time. It was a respected profession where you had to be very learned and have kind of a specialty knowledge. You have to be a real student of science, no scientific method, and you also make good money, and it can, it sort of it could potentially lead you to other great things as well. So he was very, very practical. So there was never a moment where I said, I want to be a doctor, but it's I was kind of incepted to be a doctor. And I even remember I was invited as a junior, maybe an early senior year at our local Key Club to give a talk, because I was the student of the month or something for National Honor Society. So they wanted me to come up, and I had to give a talk about what I wanted to do. And I remember sitting there and writing, I was I don't really know why I want to be a doctor, except that my dad thought it would be a good idea. But here I am so many years later, and what an amazing, prescient opportunity it was for me to go down that route, because I just love my job. I love everything about it. Most things about it, but I generally love being a doctor, and it kind of worked out well.
That's great. And I'm interested in hearing more. Aside from National Honor Society, did you have any community attachments or affiliations during your time prior to your undergraduate years?
Yeah, so I mean, like I mentioned, so we had a really large sort of Indian community in kind of the Dallas-Fort Worth area with respect to the arts. I think about my own experiences. I was actually like, when I was a kid, I wanted to be in the NFL. So I played football, and I actually think playing seventh, eighth, ninth grade football, I got really invested in physical fitness and being good at sports, and it was a community for me. So many of my friends came out of that. But I actually made a very, very hard pivot in my freshman year. I had a choir director who I think saw something in me and was like, "What are you doing playing football, man? Like, you should be doing more with us." And so actually, after my sophomore year, I made a very, very strong pivot towards more choral music. And that ended up, I think about what that means to me now, and that was such an important move that I made because it really allowed me to understand music theory and melody, harmony, how multiple voices come together to create something larger. And a choir became a really, really big focal point outside of the academic bit of school and friends and social circles and stuff. I would say choir probably was sort of my defining thing. I was that singer. I was that guy who sang and played guitar and was in choir. And I also got involved in the show choir, which is kind of show choir is like, the old Glee Club, but it was more sophisticated than that. We actually had a professional dancer who would do all of our choreography that we contracted, and we put on shows as part of our larger choir performances. And yeah, that was like a very big distinction. It was like a big point of pride. And I think back in so many of my formative memories out of high school, and a lot of the friends that I continue to have kind of were derived from that.
Yeah, I'm also from Texas, so we understand that choir and football, the whole UIL system is very intensive.
It
so
is,
I kind of
yeah.
want to learn, how did you balance those extracurriculars with, just being a student?
I didn't make the distinction at all. I think that was the key. And I actually think that's a secret to maintaining, like, no matter what you do, when you sort of maintain that, like, sort of passion projects, is that those need to be woven into the identity, your own identity. And so I really didn't kind of differentiate those things. Yes, I mean, we have homework that we have to finish, and there are certain measures you have to meet, to pass your course or, get A's on your course or whatever. But yeah, it was always after school for me. It's like, I came home and I played music. Like, I didn't really watch after like I was in ninth grade. Like, I came home and I like turned the music up and I played guitar and sang and went back for show choir practices in the evening and tried to get my homework done in between. My parents were pretty hands off as well, so they didn't, they weren't always looking over my shoulder to see if I was completing everything. It was very much like my responsibility to make sure everything got done. And yeah, I think I was able to sort of strike a balance pretty well because I went after the things that I really liked to do. And there was a culture of doing well in school. Like, my dad, it went to basically the prestigious school in India, and come hell or high water, you're going to do well in school. And that trickled down, that culture trickled down. And my mom was, very supportive of that. She was a stay-at-home mom, so I never had to think about meals. I never had to think about snacks. I never had to think about moral support because she was that rock and pillar for me. So that stuff came easy. I had that support. And the rest of it was just, taking care of what I needed to do academically, which was solely my responsibility, and then doing the fun stuff like choir and football and things that made me happy on the side.
So I'm going to flash forward a bit to 2011. As a medical student, I read that you received an international education scholarship during your time at A&M. Could you tell me more about that experience?
Yeah, it was actually, it was kind of just a lark. I saw it, and I really wanted to go to India for a little bit to particularly go to look at some infectious diseases that I hadn't come across. I went to medical school at A&M, and our teaching hospital was Baylor Scott and White in Temple, which is just an absolutely incredible medical institution. I just can't say enough about that place. It's like a hub in Central Texas, which feeds to so many different communities in Central Texas, wide-ranging tentacles. So I got to meet so many interesting people doing interesting things. But there were some things that you just don't see. You don't see leprosy, and you don't see, schistosomiasis, and you don't see leptospirosis and all the forms of tuberculosis. And I wanted to do that. And I actually, growing up, I had gone to India every other year for like an entire 3 months of my life. Like every other summer, I was basically in India, and I basically spent that entire time, with only some small exceptions, in the South with my family. And so I feel like, yes, those were formative experiences, but there was parts of India that I really wanted to spend more time, and specifically I wanted to go to Bombay. And so I applied for the scholarship, and A&M was like, yeah, just you can take this money and go apply. And so I applied. There weren't that many at that time. There weren't that many places to sort of apply. It was just sort of like catch as catch can kind of thing. But I did find this hospital in Bombay. It's in this neighborhood called Parel, which is pretty well known. And there's a community, like a county hospital, sort of equivalent of a government. It's a government hospital called King Edward Memorial Hospital, had an associated medical school called CGS Medical College. And I just threw in an application saying, hey, I'm an international student. I'll pay your fees or whatever. Just let me spend a month there. And by the way, I want to live at the medical center dorm, the med school dorm. And they were like, yeah, just come on over. Of course, there was some bureaucratic stuff. I had to apply. I had to get a student visa, which was a little tricky actually to get at that time. I think it's a lot easier to do now. And there was some permitting that I had to do, but pretty much all of the permitting was done once I arrived there. And it was such a cool experience because I lived in sort of a shared, it was sort of a shared bathroom. I did get my own room, which was pretty cool. And at that time I just had to pay a little bit of money, and guys came over, just dropped some fiber optic cables in my dorm room. So I got cable internet, which was awesome. I mean, at that time it wasn't really that common, especially there. But I spent about 5 weeks, as I recall, at King Edward, and it was just what an experience. I got to meet so many other international medical students. I made friends with some students from the UK, and then a couple of students from Afghanistan who are from Kandahar, who were doing training there, getting some experience. And we basically formed a little team. We did a lot of social stuff together, went to the beach together, basically saw patients together. And, as a government hospital, there is some resource limitations that you see. And one of the biggest things is, at Scott and White and Temple, it was a wonderful teaching hospital, but there was some basic stuff. Every patient generally got their own room, and there were some privacies built into the experience, right? But at this government hospital, you're talking about just a humongous ward, or wards that were divided. So essentially a warehouse situation where you walk in and there's just bed after bed after bed after bed, and just a variety of diseases that you would sort of take care of. And I got to sort of meet with the teaching faculty there, who were so gracious to spend time with me and teach me. I'll never forget this guy, Nikhil Carnatic was his name, just like a gold standard critical care physician who led me around with his service. I couldn't really do a lot of hands-on stuff for obvious reasons, but I got to just spend time with patients, interview them, go on rounds, watch procedures, do some intakes of patients in the ER setting. One of the very first patients I saw was a kid who basically had fever and cough, and they got an X-ray. I mean, this kid is just like breathing, coughing in front of me, and a huge tuberculosis cavity breathing in my face. So I was pretty sure that I was going to convert my TB test when I came back, but thankfully that didn't happen. But it was it was really an exercise in watching how resource allocation works, which would come back to me later, like when in my COVID days. Some of those flashbacks came back to me. But the grace with which I was treated, I will never forget. Also, it really helped me, learn medicine that I just didn't get to see in the United States because of how, our vaccinations and public health infrastructure, allows a lot of these infectious diseases to essentially be short of eliminated. So we just don't see a lot of that stuff. But suffice it to say, there were many questions that came up on standardized tests that I got right because I did that, 5 weeks in India. I'll never forget it. And what was cool about it was that I got to kind of be on my own. I didn't know anybody in Mumbai, so I got to fend for myself. I had to kind of pick up some of the language on my own. And, I think that type of discomfort makes you a stronger person, and I think that's something that I still carry with me.
So moving on to your undergraduate to your residency years,
Yeah.
you went to UT for biochemistry and then
Yeah.
Georgetown for your residency.
Right.
Can you walk me through your journey as an undergrad to medical school, and how was DC compared to Texas?
Yeah. So let me start with undergrad. So at that time, there was the top 10% rule
Mm-hmm.
in effect, which I know is a lot more exclusive now. It's something like top 5 or 6%.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I was at a 5A gigantic high school. So I had almost 800 students in my graduating class. So I just needed to be in the top 80, right? So I think I graduated like 45 or 50 or something. And so it was basically I knew that I wanted to go to a state school. I actually applied to UT Arlington. I applied to 3 schools. UT Arlington because my dad asked me to. He was a professor there. Texas A&M and UT. My brother was already at UT. He was actually in his junior year when I was applying. So I actually came to Austin, I think after my junior year, to spend a little bit of time with him. And that was the first time I'd spent any significant time in Austin and kind of saw the campus and the various student groups. And my brother was really involved in an a cappella group, and he was in a rock band. I was like, this is what I want to do. And it was basically a foregone conclusion that I would come to UT. And, I really thrived in sort of the social environment of a large high school. So UT, was basically that on steroids. It was much, much bigger. But I felt really prepared. I had a lot of friends who came with me from school too, so that was really nice. So I had a community that was already sort of built in. Music really was another avenue for me to succeed. I was a huge sports fan, so it was really cool to go to a school that had that tradition of really big basketball program, big football program, great baseball program. UT tennis was awesome at that time. So it was kind of nice to have that aspect of the collegiate experience. I was pretty single-minded. If I could do it again, I would not have chosen biochemistry. It was a very, very, very conservative choice. But I learned a lot, and it made me a smarter person. A lot of those classes, particularly in the chemistries, those sciences really challenged me. Organic chemistry, I had a professor there, Brent Iverson, I will never forget, who was he taught me how to be a good teacher, and I think about him a lot as I'm a teacher myself, about how to leverage pop culture and music and literature as avenues to teach students. And that was a very challenging class as well. In fact, it was sort of a weed out class. Thankfully, I did all right. Physical chemistry, extraordinarily challenging. So I think it really challenged me, and I got a really, really great social sort of experience while I was there. I actually came when I was in medical school. So I went to A&M for medical school, and after my I think my third year, I came up to. No, after my second year, I came up to D.C. My brother was living in D.C., and I stayed with him. He was in Arlington, Virginia. And my cousin, who from Florida, was actually doing not an interview, a tour. Mm-hmm. She was doing a school tour of Georgetown. So she happened to be in town, and she was like, I don't want to go alone. Will you come with me? So I got to go with her, and I toured Georgetown. And I went there and I said, this is where I want to go. This place, incredible traditions, beautiful campus, very erudite, I guess. The medical center was kind of on the on one end of the campus, and I took one look at it and I was like, this is where I want to come. So when I had an opportunity in medical school in my fourth year, once I figured out kind of which way I wanted to go, I actually applied for an away rotation at Georgetown. And sort of succeeded with that, got sort of ingratiated myself with the faculty there, and I was able to thankfully match there in residency, which Georgetown and DC is my, I have had the pleasure of traveling a lot internationally and nationally, and DC is still my favorite city in the world. It's small, it's big without being small. There's always something just extraordinarily interesting going on that's usually free at any given moment. This kind of political current events sort of flair to it is really, really appealing. A young sort of energetic crowd, great restaurants, really interesting arts scene. I just loved, aside from cost of living, I guess, I loved everything about it. And to spend 4 years there was a true pleasure. I have so many lifelong friends I made through my residency program. Shortly after I got married, my wife joined me up there for the remaining 3 years. And that also is a very special place for me because that's kind of where my wife and I learned how to be husband and wife. I was in D.C. together. And we sort of forged our own identity before we came back home to Texas. So can't say enough. I guess I'll put it that way.
Yeah, so I understand that internal medicine and pediatrics is a combined specialty of both fields. What brought you to that path?
Yeah, I had great mentorship. So much of the decisions we make is based on like mentors, people we model ourselves after. And I had a couple of mentors, and you make this decision into whatever specialty you go to. You make that kind of at the tail end of your third year, early fourth year of medical school. And I had multiple people at A&M, particularly Curtis Marcus and Teresa McNeil. They actually ran the internal medicine program. They were the program directors for that specialty. And I found out that A&M used to have this so-called combined internal medicine and pediatrics program. And, I sort of pulled the thread and wanted to ask what that was. And they told me essentially you spend 2 years doing nothing but internal medicine stuff, 2 years of doing pediatric stuff. It's a very intense 4 years. It's really a lot of time in the hospital taking care of patients. But hey, at the end of 4 years, you have the opportunity to be board certified in both internal medicine and pediatrics. You also have, if you decide to go into a specialty, you actually have both the adult and childhood specialties available to you. And so to me, it was like a very low trade-off. So it was a very practical decision, actually. I was like, I could do this in 4 years and have all these options, or I could go into internal medicine or pediatrics and spend 3 years doing each of these with more limited options. I was like, why don't I just do the 4-year thing, and have a lot more options? And I'm glad I did it because actually, same thing. It's like my mentorship at the internal medicine pediatrics program at Georgetown was irreplaceable and was so formative for me. It just was a wonderful decision, and I'm glad I did it.
Thank you. So I noticed that during your time at Georgetown, you won the Edward Tsou Award for Humanities in 2016. I want to ask, what would you say is the importance of the humanities in medicine? And could you share some of your work in this field? I know you mentioned music and pop culture.
Yeah.
And also, could you touch on what the recognition was for in particular?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's that particular award. I mean, Edward Tsou is sort of a legend. He recently passed away, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But he was sort of a critical care teaching physician, academician sort of model. And he had all these he was very old school. He had all these great quips. So I had the opportunity to round with him. He would come really more of an emeritus role to just round with our ICU teams. And, some of that stuff doesn't age too well, some of the stuff he would say, but I'll sort of leave it at that. But he was quite a personality, and he was also extraordinarily gifted outside medicine. And I think people liked the fact that I had sort of this parallel universe I lived in outside of medicine while I was in D.C. And I was in a music group called Suppin, which was super active, and we got to perform at so many of the arts events around the city. We performed at various museums. There was a really famous restaurant, coffee shop called Busboys and Poets. It's sort of Busboys is sort of like I don't know. It's like a kind of a liberal sort of think tank in and of itself, and they had a really cool performing space, and we performed there several times. So I developed this reputation as sort of this artistic guy outside of medicine who loved to read, loved to play music, and I think people noticed when I would interact with patients, hey, this guy really brings up a lot of these other things to connect with these patients. And so I think that's kind of how that came about. If I had to guess, I don't know the nitty-gritty of why I was chosen for that, but I think that has a lot to do with it. And I would say, medicine, it's a really one of the things I love about medicine. The thing I love maybe most about my job is that despite being sort of a doctoral guy, I have an MD. I associate with people who are not like me all the time, and I don't live in a bubble because because I have my patients. They are my anchor into the real world. Because I notice, right? I mean, most people hang out with other people who are kind of in their same socioeconomic realm. That's just what happens. Rarely do those barriers get knocked down. But when you're a doctor and you really want to connect with your patients, unless you truly are a little sociopathic, like you need to be able to connect with everybody, and you need to be able to talk to everybody. And so I never feel like I'm in a bubble. I got a lot of red hats that come into my clinic. You know what I mean? So. And I have to no matter where people fall sort of on the political spectrum, or the educational spectrum, disease is non-discriminating. Mm-hmm. And I get to, that's one of the pleasures of the job, is that I get to interact with every type of person. I have to be able to get along with and basically work alongside every type of person in order to a common end to try to alleviate suffering and make people feel better. And so connecting with people is really, really important. And if it's just all, the nuts and bolts of medicine that you use to connect with people, it's going to be a long road. Like, you have to be able to connect with people. So I spend a lot of time, talking about people's interests, outside of the disease that I'm helping them manage. What do they like to do? What do they do for work? Where are they from? If they're immigrants, where in the world did your family come from, and how did you end up here? And do you play instruments? And what kind of music do you like? And what kind of books do you read? I have so many patients. Actually, there are certain patients I'll see on my clinic schedule. I'll say, hey, this is the guy. I need to talk to Bill about, what are his book recommendations? Because we always hit it off on. I gave him a great book recommendation. I'm going to ask about that. And I also want to find out, what's the latest album he listened to? Did he like the new Springsteen album? And because we talked about that last time. And I just find that, like, this is a really great way to gain trust with patients. They start seeing you as more than their doctor, but as a confidant. Mm-hmm. They start seeing you as a human being, and they're much more vulnerable to you as a result. They are more revealing to you about what's going well, what's not going well. How adherent are they to their medicines? What are the obstacles? If you can kind of knock down these barriers, you're just a better doctor. I don't know how else to put that. You're much more available to them. And so I think in that sense, the humanities is a really, really big part of how I sort of operate in the clinical environment. And I could say the exact same thing about teaching. I could say the exact same thing about how I talk to students, my trainees who are residents and fellows, that I have to find a way. It's incumbent upon me to connect with them in ways that, you are not maybe so intuitive. And I think the relationships go a lot longer when you do that.
Thank you. And I definitely notice how you value equity in your own research. I noticed a substantial research interest in cystic fibrosis and bronchiectasis. What brought you to this inquiry, especially with understanding that CF has historically been seen as a white disease? Why did you decide that this needed to be your work?
Yeah, it's one of those things. Same thing, sort of mentorship helped me sort of see this stuff. I went into pulmonary critical care medicine because my mentors were pulmonary critical care physicians. The people I modeled myself as after in residency were pulmonary critical care physicians. So I got my sort of foot in the door and that way. And when I, as an internal medicine and pediatrics guy, I could sort of longitudinally see how disease affects people. I think maybe a little uniquely. I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but maybe people in that specialty, because you're not only taking care of kids, but you're also taking care of adults. So you kind of see this transition, genetic diseases, childhood diseases that kind of carry forth into adulthood, like congenital heart disease or congenital pulmonary diseases. You want to be you want to be the person who can kind of like take care of people at, from cradle to the grave, so to speak, with these diseases. And cystic fibrosis, to me, was sort of in the pulmonary world, my specialty was sort of the gold standard for that. So again, it was a very practical decision, but one sort of born by mentorship. So when I came to fellowship, at Baylor, when I trained, I actually specifically requested, in addition to my usual pulmonary and critical care training, I wanted to spend, we have a really big, we have a huge cystic fibrosis program at Baylor. I was like, I want to spend longitudinally some time in the clinic with these patients so that at the end of my 3 years of training, I'm like ready to go here. I can take care of these guys. And so Baylor was willing to meet me there. And Marcia Katz, who was the cystic fibrosis program director at the time, Tara Barta, who's the associate director and is now the director, They both kind of took me on and they provided me mentorship. So that sort of built that part of it. And then the bronchiectasis is basically is basically a disease state that is very, very tied to cystic fibrosis. And to me, it was a very practical decision to be able to kind of very broadly take care of both kind of sets of patients. And it's one of those things, you sort of develop kind of valuable skill set managing certain types of patients. And if you get really, really good at it, more and more people hear about you and they come. And so we've been able to sort of like expand the programs for these diseases just based on expertise. Now, as far as equity goes, I'm trying to think like how I came to that, and I have to say the answer is probably still mentorship, because my research mentor is Raksha Jain, who is just a dynamo academic physician scientist at UT Southwestern in Dallas, and she did the biggest study to date of Hispanic patients with cystic fibrosis and looked at their outcomes. And maybe not too much of a surprise that Hispanic patients with cystic fibrosis actually don't do as well as their sort of white non-Hispanic counterparts. And then that's sort of like, you start looking at signals there, like insurance and poverty and access to certain types of life-changing medicines, and of course there's deficits there in sort of underserved populations. So I really, again, maybe it was a practical decision. I was like, this has always been considered a white disease, which is not true, actually. It is largely white, but there's a lot more diversity than we ever thought. I was very curious, because I was taking care of a lot of black patients with cystic fibrosis, and I was like, how does this population do? And so that was sort of the impetus for getting this done. And so we ended up, with Dr. Jane's mentorship, we actually approached the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation for, their large data sets on outcomes, and the registry data basically has a lot of input data from a lot of centers around the country. And we were able to kind of, in an isolated manner, look at the black population and sort of compare them to sort of their national counterparts to kind of see how they do. And that's interesting because, the data wasn't perfect because there's certain variables, like, for example, poverty, very, very hard to capture exactly the extent of poverty in a registry, because it's all based on what patients will and will not allow to go into the registry. So actually, we weren't really totally able to control for those types of variables too well. But we actually found out that the situation for the black population is interestingly not indistinct from the white population. So actually, they don't do. It's quite equivalent. That's kind of what the data shows. So, but we were able to show that, and it was nice to actually do a very well designed project and actually bring that to fruition, get it published, have it be recognized at a national level, which we were able to get done, and actually present some bit of good news that actually, hey, the black population actually is fairly well cared for with this disease state.
Thank you. And as a researcher in general, how has the tightening of research funds affected your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say for me personally, I have not been affected by this, but I have had so many colleagues who have been affected. So I think the biggest issue, it's one thing to say that, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, are not going to be looked at the same way going forward, right? I mean, as long as you give people sort of advance warning that there's going to be sort of a change in priorities of how these grants are going to be funded, I think there is, you could make an argument, let's put it that way. Not that I agree with it, but you can make an argument that is done. But what really was detrimental and destructive was the retroactive canceling of grants, looking at things like black patients' outcomes in prostate cancer. When you retroactively go and eliminate grants, good research gets nullified, and you start really affecting the livelihood of researchers and institutions. One thing that I did not appreciate is that national grants, they a lot of times allow these big academic institutions to pay the bills because these academic institutions like Baylor College of Medicine, my own employer, for example, really relies on some of the indirect funding from these large grants to, keep staff, keep the lights on. And in some sense, it represents a national investment in large, really good academic centers. And that's the kind of partnerships you want to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you tell an institution like Baylor, for example, that you're going to suddenly cancel 50% of their grants, it causes untold damage to institutions, researchers, and research missions. So I have had so many colleagues who have been negatively affected by this, too many to name, that are just trying to figure out a way around this. For now, the courts at least have kind of helped us sort of slow the impact of some of these things, but I think it's a long road ahead, and unfortunately, I do wonder if maybe the damage has been done. Administratively, this is the same administration we're going to have to keep in place for another few years, so there's a long road ahead, I think, for these institutions to sort of maintain academic rigor and integrity in the studies they produce.
Thank you so much for your insight. And as a South Asian physician doing research on anti-Black health disparities, do you see connections between the struggles of different communities with the medical system?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I think any social scientist, the famous saying, right, is that you can basically predict somebody's outcomes from a health standpoint just by looking at their zip code, right? That's all you need to have a pretty good understanding of how they're going to fare with something like heart disease or cancer. And that's just a shame, because it really just tells you that there are the impact, the socioeconomic impacts of those types of truths. So, in that sense, it can be a little depressing at times, because from a health standpoint, as a doctor, you want to believe that you have a really big impact on somebody's health. Unfortunately, you probably have like a 15% impact, right? If you look at sort of socioeconomic status impacts, you probably as a physician have maybe 15% of the impact of their overall health trajectory. The rest of it has to do with their zip code, how much income they have. Do they have a two-parent household? What's their parents' education? What's their own education? Is there a grocery store nearby where they can get food? What's the number of fast food restaurants they have in their area, because it's going to guide their nutritional selections. This is somewhat common sense, and we kind of know this now. But, oh, yeah, absolutely. I think when you look at inequities in the system, they are what goes on in medicine is completely indistinguishable what's happening societally.
Thank you. As someone who speaks both Tamil and Spanish, what role has being multilingual played in your medical practice, particularly with your work in equity?
Yeah, it has made all the difference. I mean, for me, Tamil specifically is more of a personal benefit, right? I mean, it allows me to connect well with family, and culturally when I visit India. Knowing Spanish has been invaluable to my job, and I get to, I don't really consider it practice, but I carry out healthcare using this language, and I'm able to connect with patients so much better. In fact, I can't even tell you the sense of relief so many patients have. Like when I walk into the room, and there's maybe multiple family members, the patient is kind of speaking perhaps in broken English, and there's somebody there who clearly doesn't understand English. And then when I can just switch into Spanish, ¿prefieren ustedes que hablo en español o prefieres inglés? I mean, that makes such the brightness that you see. They're like just so relieved that, hey, this guy can understand me, and I can actually give you my message, as a patient. So I think it's made such a difference for me to sort of establish more intimate relationships with my patients. And of course, my colleagues who are like Vietnamese, for example, who can do this. I can't do this with my Vietnamese patients. I got a lot of Vietnamese patients. I can't do that because I don't speak the language, but my friends and colleagues who can, they feel the same way when it comes to Vietnamese or Korean. So I would say from an equity standpoint, I do believe that you can provide better care through direct connection with your patients rather than through a translator. It's just a truth of the matter. I will say that institutions, like I'm talking about Baylor, we have a very sophisticated translation process. We actually have these nice sort of on wheels translator systems. You just quickly press a button and you're connected with somebody that can speak the language. Even something, for our Filipino patients, Tagalog, you can quickly pick up somebody. You can easily get Russian, Amharic for our Ethiopian patients. Like, it's very doable. So it's not that you can't provide good care, but it certainly is a lot more fruitful when you can connect directly with patients in their chosen preferred language.
Thank you. In 2020, you were on a panel for India House Houston talking about COVID-19. What was it like being a doctor during this first surge, and also being asked to speak to the Indian American community?
Yeah, that was quite an interesting experience. I joined faculty with Baylor in August of 2019. So I had kind of an idea of what I wanted my career to look like. But, within 7 months, we had the pandemic start, and, everything changed. And so, I actually, I was supposed to be kind of like a 50-50 inpatient and outpatient kind of split doctor. But when the pandemic hit, we found out quickly was that even in a medical center like Houston, it was going to be very easy for us to be overwhelmed on the hospital side of things. So my chief, Ivan Rosas, asked me and one of my colleagues if we could just pull out of the clinic altogether and just be full-time ICU doctors for about I think it ended up being about 4 months that we did that. And that was pretty nuts, man. I mean, that we got to experience a disease as it was unfolding. We got to understand the true meaning of what it means to live in a global society now, where people, Houston is a international city. So we could not be shielded from this at all. And so to see and also experience what happens to a system when it's stretched, not having enough personal protective equipment around, not having enough beds, not having enough ventilators, trying to improvise using portable ventilators and what are called BiPAP machines to serve as ventilators. We were using a relatively new technology called high-flow systems, which ended up saving probably millions of lives nationally and tens of millions of lives internationally. To kind of see that all unfold in real time was quite surreal. And it was very challenging. I would say, because you felt like you didn't have control of the situation at all. COVID caused something in people's lungs called ARDS when they got particularly sick. And we knew there are many other things that cause that state in the lungs. And in ARDS, sometimes you were looking at mortality rates 30 to 40%. Like many, many people didn't survive that. And COVID, if people sort of met that ARDS definition, we saw sort of similar mortality rates. So that was really frustrating. It also is frustrating to see colleagues get sick. Thankfully, most people ended up more with mild infections on the hospital side. But, we did have an ICU doctor in North Houston who actually died from COVID. He had ARDS from COVID and died, a beloved colleague. But it was kind of a very it was a very fascinating, thinking about it, tragic and fascinating at the same time, to see how the health system sort of accommodated that. And we obviously lost so many patients. The India, I can talk a little bit more about that, but the India House experience was kind of earlier. It was in the summer of that year when I partnered with a infectious disease doctor in Clear Lake, and we kind of talked to the Indian American community through India House, which is sort of a non-for-profit, I would say a charity institution that provides a lot of free services, very good, interesting free services, but also a lot of like psychosocial support. They do fitness classes, and it's a big community basically. And so it was an honor to be asked to come talk to them. But I actually looked at that recording not long ago, and we didn't know much at that time when we gave that talk. There was still so much uncertainty about what it was, how it was spread, how do you protect yourself? Do you have to bleach your Amazon boxes that were sitting outside? A lot of that stuff was still being discussed. So there was a lot of ignorance, unfortunately, that came with that. But I think we were just kind of doing our best to keep the community up to date about what we knew. I would say, going into later in the pandemic, we got the healthcare workers. I got my first vaccine in December of 2020, and then I got my booster in January of 2021. So we had very high hopes that we would be able to shut this thing down then. But lo and behold, in April, we got our first cases of the Delta variant in Houston and within the United States. In fact, I think Houston had some of the earliest cases. Actually, one of my family members was one of the first people in Houston to die from Delta variant. So we had two family members, both from my wife's side, who actually died from Delta variant COVID, which was unbelievable. To me, that was the hardest part of the pandemic as a doctor, because it was so virulent. It was the mortality rates were very high. It was very, very challenging, and tragically, we had vaccine at the time, and pretty much all we were seeing at that time was people who were unvaccinated dying from COVID-19. So what I felt to be, unlike in 2020, which was a complete unknown, right? You were just doing the best you can. But in 2021, April onward, when we had the ability to vaccinate the public, and there were so many conspiracy theories, and doctors were getting in the crosshairs. Obviously, a lot of our friends at NIH and related institutions were in the crosshairs. And essentially, there was a segment of the population that was choosing not to be vaccinated, that was bearing the brunt of it. That was really, 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 really hard, because we had really draconian family visitation rules at those times, which I actually think was a mistake, but more on that later, I guess. We had so families were actually, their family members were dying in our ICUs, and they couldn't visit, which was horrific. And having to talk to them about that, especially for a disease that was preventable at that time, was really tragic, and in some ways, in my mind, somewhat unforgivable. And that caused a huge amount of depression in our ranks. I think that was the low point, actually. Thankfully, end of 21, when we started to see more Omicron variants, and we saw the virus sort of mutate out of being deadly and be more sort of just contagious. Obviously, that was better, and we were able to kind of breathe a big sigh of relief. But 2021 was, I would say, the hardest year, even harder than 2020.
Thank you. And I'm so sorry to hear about your loss.
Thank you for the condolences.
To say the least, thank you for your work. And moving on to, I guess, another point. What's your relationship with the South Asian community like here in Houston?
Yeah, that's a good question. I moved to Houston in 2016 for my training, and my wife is born and raised in Sugar Land, and she has an enormous family in Houston. So I was a bit intimidated when I first moved, but that has made all the difference. So my sort of Asian American, Indian American community here is, I would say, largely influenced by my wife's family, which has been, a revelation, earth-shattering for me. It has opened up so many avenues to meet so many interesting people and really be immersed in Indian culture to the extent that I would like. This is just something funny to share, is that when my wife was asking, because I was prepared to live in D.C. for the rest of my life after training there. My wife really wanted to move back for many reasons, but I said I would move back. However, I got to live in the loop. So that was one concession that was granted to me. So I still feel like I'm able to kind of keep my options open in terms of like which community I get to sort of hang out with. But, through Asia Society, which, my family is very, very involved in, and my wife's family sort of in, the greater Sugar Land, greater Houston area, my sort of involvement in the Indian American community has never been bigger. And I would say I've never been more proud to be part of it, because as an Asian American who grew up here, I'm sure you can identify that when you're growing up, especially if you're growing up in an area which is predominantly not like you, sometimes your identity can be, your immigrant sort of background identity can be something you try to suppress, and you don't really embrace to the full extent that you should or could. But as I've gotten older, I've gotten more interested in my own culture. And now that I have kids, I really want to be able to share that culture with my children so that they grow up embracing that from an early age and not hiding it or suppressing it as sometimes we do. So I think, given my own interest and and what I would like to see my kids grow up around, I have been never more open to sort of my own roots and kind of celebrating that.
Thank you. So your CV mentions that you play in a rock band called Little Victories, and I have to ask, what kind of rock music are we talking about, and what instrument do you play? I just want to learn more about what music looks like for you now.
Yeah, this is like one of my most fun things that I do outside of work. It's a full-fledged rock band. So it's a 4-piece group. I'm the lead singer. I play mostly rhythm guitar, some lead guitar. I've got a drummer who's a good singer. I've got a fantastic lead guitar player who's also a fantastic keyboardist, and I've got a bass guitar player. Yeah, and I don't know when this interview will come out, but we have a gig coming up December 11th at this really interesting local distillery called Drop of the Creator. We actually got to play at a show, just to finish the thought, 8 p.m. at Drop of the Creator. We actually got to play at White Oak Music Hall in the spring, which is like kind of a marquee Houston venue as part of this huge event called Law Rocks in April. We're going to play that again next year. But it's one of my greatest outlets, and we practice at my house every Tuesday. I have a little studio space where we get together, and we play for like 2 hours a week. And we these days, before pandemic, we were really, 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 really active, and we would play like probably 75% original music that I write or my drummer writes. These days, we do more covers. We're trying to incorporate more original music, but we have less time to write music these days, so we play a lot of like 70s, 80s, 90s rock music, and have fun with it. We're a stage presence, hype type of band, so we do have a lot of fun with it. And to me, it's just like the best outlet.
Thank you. And so you're currently a course director for the critical care rotation.
Yeah.
And you also received multiple awards for your teaching. And can you tell me more about your pedagogical practice and what's it like being an educator? What would you like your students to learn beyond just the technical stuff?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's kind of, I've always considered myself like a good teacher, mostly because I come from a line of teachers. My father is a prolific educator. He's retiring after, he joined UT Arlington in the early 90s, so like more than 30 years of teaching as a professor at UT Arlington in engineering. And he was my model for how to do it. So I've sat in on his classes, when I was in high school and stuff. So I got a feel for, he was my influence as to how you connect with students, which is connect with them in every way that you can and be creative with how you do it. His father is also a prolific teacher. So I think my sister's a teacher as well. She's an academic physician. So I feel like it runs in the bloodstream, I suppose. But yeah, my approach is, I think I've mentioned, is to try to connect with students. It's very important for me to try to figure out what their goals are. I think that's a good starting point. So anytime I'm on hospital service and I'm running a pulmonary service where I'm seeing 20, 30 patients, and I always have trainees of various stripes that are on there. It's kind of important to start off to know what are their goals. What would they like to get out of this? And then that way you can sort of tailor the experience, because you do have students that frankly don't have a lot of interest in what you're doing, and you may want to have a different approach for them. But there may be some students that really want to do what you do. They want to go into your field. They want to know how you excel in this field. What are the things that they need to know? They want to learn how to do procedures like I do. There are certain procedures that I do in medicine, and they want to learn that stuff. Put a chest tube in, or do an intubation, or do a bronchoscopy. So that gives me an idea about how I can incorporate that student in the education. Almost all students appreciate chalk talk, so I always try to incorporate that, talk about a subject that is pertinent to a patient maybe they're taking care of, and do a chalk talk, do something, it's increasingly less, or it's decreasingly on a chalkboard and more on my iPad mini, which I just write on and talk them through lectures, or perhaps it's a PowerPoint. I also try to get them to do little presentations on a topic of interest to them that maybe pertains to a patient they've been seeing. and then provide them good feedback on that. A 5-minute discussion handout, PowerPoint that they give, and then I give them some feedback. So to me, it's kind of a full service thing, which is I kind of find out what they want to know, what they'd like to learn, try to tailor the education to them, try to bring it to them in a form that sort of is easily digestible and memorable, and then provide them sort of good feedback at the end. I think if you can do that, you can be a successful teacher. Mm-hmm. And when I say successful, I mean it gives you a certain street cred. Your evaluations will probably be good. Your student evaluations will probably be good, and you will probably feel good as well about what was done there. And what more can you ask for? One of the great things about my job now is seeing we students that started off as medical students go on and come back to me later and talk about how, hey, this topic, you discussed, you gave me this, this little short presentation on hyponatremia, which is something we see a lot in the hospital. I'll never forget the way you made me sort of think about that, and thanks for doing that. It sort of informs how I teach it now. I mean, that's like the best compliment you can get, and not that that's why we do it, but if you are very strategic and intentional about your approach to teaching, you will see stuff like this happen.
Yes, and from your perspective as both an educator and a practicing physician and researcher, what are things that you would like to see change in academic medicine in the next 20 years?
Wow, that's a big question. Let me think about that. I think one of the challenges, and I think it's a challenge that is already being met to some degree, certainly by Baylor, and I'll tell you what I mean, which is kind of disrupting the usual model of how you teach, like let's say medical students, which is 2 years in a classroom doing nothing but sort of theoretical sort of rote memorization work, and then 2 years in like the clinical environment where you just learn how to take care of patients. And then you try to remember what you learned in those first 2 years to try to apply to the patients that you're taking care of. So creating curricula that are more integrated. I am proud that I've seen this as a course director and as somebody who's really been invested now for the last several years in specifically medical student education. I see this happening. There is a lot more intention and thought that's being put towards integrating these things so students spend, less time in a lecture hall. They're doing a lot more hands-on work. They're working with standardized patients early to kind of figure out how to do a patient interview. They are going through problem-based learning, which is I'm not sure if you're familiar with problem-based or team-based learning, where you're working with small groups. You do these dissections of like cases that faculty come up with that like really do a good job of tying together a disease state like HIV. I mean, can you really learn about HIV unless you talk about somebody's socioeconomic status? Mm-hmm. Can you really talk about HIV spread unless you talk about sexual practices? Can you really talk about HIV without talking about other sexually transmitted diseases or misconceptions about sexual health? And who are the populations that are most affected and why? And so you can create this sort of really integrated curriculum where you're starting to tie together like societal stuff mm-hmm. with medicine, where the rubber meets the road, and getting students to think critically about stuff like this early. It's a great way to think about how to not only produce doctors, but also advocates for patients. Get them to understand the full breadth of like an HIV problem. And you can do that with cancer, right? There are cancer clusters in Houston even. What is it about those clusters? Well, you can start talking about pollution, how pollution practices and Superfunds and waste disposal practices can actually downstream cause cancer clusters. Well, that has to do with how city policy, how the city council votes mm-hmm. on where these Superfunds go, like these dumping grounds go. Well, that has something to do with politics, right? And how do you, and public policy. So I think this is a really interesting challenge, and I see Baylor is tackling this, is kind of threading together all these topics with stuff that's directly pertinent to medicine. And I'm really excited about that. I think that's really a good way to sort of teach students, to get them to understand things for the long haul, and not just like these bits of information you got to learn, rote memory, do a quiz, do a test, move on, see patient, see do that kind of thing. I think there's a lot more opportunity to create much more of a cohesive, integrated curriculum. And again, I really think Baylor, if you look at what Baylor is doing, I was pretty skeptical when I looked at what they were doing, but count me in as a believer to the practices. I think we're gonna produce much more holistically focused students.
Thank you. And moving on to my final few questions. If someone, perhaps your children, are reading or listening to this oral history in 2075, trying to understand what it's like to be an Asian American in Texas, over the course of your life, what would you like them to know?
About being an Asian American in Texas, just generally.
Yeah.
You come from a rich history, irrespective of like where specifically in Asia your family comes from, and that is something to be proud of. That is something to be embraced, and that's something you bring to the table. So my dad used to tell me, and it took a long time for me to sort of let that sink in, which is, you're in an interesting position. You could have the best of both worlds. That was the operative phrase, best of both worlds, which is be a chameleon, be able to really just completely lose yourself within your Asian American community and sort of live that experience. It's so rich. But you can also take that and you can totally pivot, and you can be, if you want to just be an average old Joe American, eating steak and potatoes, going to football games, you can do that too, right? You don't have to pick and choose, but rather let both inform each other. And that is, if you look at how American society is structured, there's so many like interesting things that make America tick and like create American culture. And if you look at the origins of that, those things come from other places. So music is like the easiest thing to point at, which is like, if you look at rock music, which is basically an American invention, born out of essentially like rhythm and blues music. Okay, where does that come from? That actually comes from maybe gospel music, actually. And then where does gospel music come from? Well, it actually comes from slave tradition. Where do slaves come from? They come from Africa. And, you can make all these really, really interesting connections that make American society what it is. And your background as an Asian American is setting America up for its next chapter. So really, incorporate that into your identity as an American. And don't shun it, because you do want to sort of incorporate it. It's a rich history, and it has so much to give. In and of itself, it has so much to give to make your own life enriched. But it actually has something to give larger American society. And I think that's how we move forward as a country. I think that's what makes America great, is this immigrant tradition of bringing the best of what your country had to offer or your culture had to offer and incorporating it. And little by little, we create our own culture as Americans, because it's a really conglomeration of so many different things. And it is sometimes I know with the political environment, and it's sometimes hard to see that, but that's the truth of America. So I really do think our best days are ahead of us, and I think the immigrant tradition that Asian Americans bring is going to be a really, really big part of that.
Thank you. And my final question, is there anything important about your experience as an Indian American physician, Houstonian, father, and husband that you would like to touch on before we conclude the interview?
I mean, there's so much I could say. I have a very great life. I have a really great life because I have a very meaningful career that gives me a lot of purpose. I have a beautiful family that gives me a lot of purpose. I have very close relationships, which give me a lot of fulfillment. I come from a very rich tradition, whether you're talking about culture or religion, that I've kind of slowly learned to embrace. and that's very meaningful to me. I find a lot of purpose through music and literature. And to me, this is what makes my identity. And I would say, as a challenge to everybody, that's listening, if you're going to even get to this part of the interview, is find out what makes you tick, and don't find out what the non-negotiables in your life, right? And the things that give you purpose, that give you satisfaction and fulfillment when you go to bed, the things that you think about when you go to bed, and the things that you think about doing and are so excited about when you wake up in the morning. Those are the components of your life that you need to build around, that you need to keep as a focus. And nobody can tell you that. Only you can know that. And so forging that identity is really, really, really important. I think that would be my message. And I'm thankful that my identity now comes from so many different sources. And when I think about how it was made possible, well, it's because his parents worked like hell to educate themselves, make a life for themselves, and basically to put me in a no-lose situation. And, for that, I'm eternally thankful. So gratitude is also a good thing. And I know I certainly could be express more gratitude day to day. My wife always reminds me. She keeps a gratitude journal to remind herself. So maybe that's a good strategy. But focusing on that and kind of the things that make up your identity, I think that's how you create fulfillment in this world. And the last thing I'll say is, and which is something I'm still figuring out, is find a way to give back to people in some form, because that really is the ultimate fulfillment.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
And also, if your wife happens to have the time, we would also love to interview her.
I would love for you to interview her. Actually, I actually passed along your email, your contact information. I think you may have gotten, if you got any Agrawals who submitted.
Yes. Oh.
That's all my family. That's my wife's family.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever they choose to set up an interview, I think you will be really pleased to get their experience, because their stories are unbelievable. I have to say, our immediate generation above, my parents' generation, my wife's parents' generation, is those stories. I never hear enough of. Those are the best.